For those of you who may not know me, my name is Heather Ardrey. I'm one of the pastors here at Christ Church and pastor of Love and Serve Albany, as well as the executive director of those ministries. I'm going to turn this just a little bit. We talked earlier about procrastination, and in my little group, I was like, I'm going to tell on myself about all the procrastinating I did all the way through college. So that's what I want to start with today. When I was in college, I would read through all of my syllabuses, and then I would type up every assignment that I had to do in every class, and I'd compile them by due date. So I'd end up with this giant, it usually was about 2 pages long. Every homework, every paper, every test, everything was on this giant list, and I would just watch the semester tick away as I crossed things off and would just go in order. But the problem with this is not an example. I don't have one of them anymore because I've lost all the files from college. But the problem with my list is that giant papers and giant projects would end up on this list as one item, right? You can see the problem. And as Mari and I were talking earlier, procrastination actually really works, which is a problem. If procrastination didn't work, we wouldn't do it quite as often, but there was nothing that a looming deadline would not fix for me, right? So give me a good panic-induced focus state and I can get anything done in a short amount of time. How many of you are like that, right? I knew I was not the only one. Could not possibly be the only one. I was talking with a friend of mine from college recently, and we used to work together on all of our major papers because we both had this same problem where we would wait, and inevitably we would not get them done in advance. And so we would crank out 15, 20-page papers in a 12-hour period of time with strategic trips to Stop and Shop to get the protein and popsicles we needed to make it through our overnight paper writing sessions. I do not recommend this. As the parent of a child who will be going to college way too soon, I do not recommend this. But I think it's common in a college setting to not really have these skills yet. It's common as adults to not really have the skills, where we just sort of put things off because the deadline is not looming yet. And my husband Dave was reminding me this week that every semester when he's teaching college, he always has students that always ask about 3 weeks after an assignment is due, what they can do to make up for the fact that they didn't do the assignment from 3 weeks ago. Every semester this happens. It's never shocking. And I was thinking a lot about deadlines and due dates as I prepared for this passage today, because I think this passage in Christian circles tends to get talked about as if it's warning or preparation for when Jesus returns someday. Right, someday in the future. And the warnings and the invitations are treated like some sort of future final exam that we can cram for because he's already delayed 2,000 years, so I've definitely got a few more years, right? At least a couple more, right? That's sort of the mindset. Yeah, that's fine. You can see that guy again. But Jesus, in this passage, when he's teaching, he's not thinking about some future due date. That's not what he has in his mind, and that's not what his disciples who are hearing it would have been hearing. We're in this extended section of Jesus' teaching. For those of you who have been around CCA for a little while, you know we've been in Luke for a long time. We're in chapter 12. We started in chapter 1, and we're going all the way to the end. But the last couple of chapters has been this extended teaching. Some of the most recent teachings that we've wrestled with, we wrestled with this one. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat, what you will wear. Your Father knows you need them. Instead, strive for his kingdom, and all these things will be given to you. So this is in the mind of his disciples when we get to today's teaching. Last week, we talked about this one. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give alms, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And last week, Pastor John talked with us about what it might actually look like to live this out today, what it might look like to sell something, to give some money away for others. If you want to catch up on all of the teachings from Luke, They live on YouTube. You can find them on there. I would encourage you to listen to last week's when John talked more deeply about this. But in our passage today, Jesus is sharing with his disciples a series of parables. And parables usually illustrate one point. The whole story, however long it is, however short it is, one point. And I think this is really helpful because it helps us not to try to take details from every parable, to try to draw direct lines from every detail to today, which for today's parables, you heard them. I am really glad that we don't have to draw direct lines from all of that stuff, seriously. You may have noticed there's a bit of intense imagery. It's a bit graphic, and it's very, very culturally distant to what we're sort of used to. The Greek word that in the passage that Sue read for us earlier was translated as servant is actually the word slave. The direct translation of that Greek word is slave. And in the version I'm going to be sort of teaching from, that's the language that's going to be used because Jesus is telling these parables in the midst of a culture that was deeply familiar with slave-master dynamics. That wasn't some foreign thing for them. That was every day. They knew folks that owned slaves. They knew folks that were slaves, and that's the culture that Jesus is speaking into. And sometimes when Jesus is teaching these parables that have one point, we're kind of left to guess what it might be. Sometimes he shares it just with his disciples afterwards. And today, I really appreciate the fact that he actually names the point in all of the parables that he's sharing with us. And if we take a bird's eye view of what Sue just read to us, we've got these 3 mini parables that are very short, and then Jesus gives us a summary, which is fantastic, I think. And then there's a question here in verse 42, and then there's this like elongated parable with a little bit of an addendum, and then another summary. So if we are getting lost in the cultural weeds here, we can come back to these summary verses that are really going to help anchor us. Does that make sense? So with this in mind, we're going to start looking at we're just going to kind of walk through it. We're going to start with the 3 mini parables. So for the first one, verses 35 and 36, Jesus says, be dressed, be ready for action. The word for be dressed is actually gird your loins. Which means what you would think it is. Like you take a dress and you like tuck it up so that you can run, right? So you have nothing in the way. So you're like tucking up all the loose material so that you're ready to go. That's what that means. That wasn't in my notes, but I just feel like you should know it because it's kind of awesome. You want me to illustrate it again? No, you can illustrate it later. That was a one-time thing. But you have to be ready. You have to be like a slave waiting for the master to return. Because you're sitting there, you don't know when the master is going to get back from the party. You've got to be ready to open the door. He could come at any time. So that's mini parable number 1. Mini parable number 2, if the master finds you waiting, you will be blessed. Blessed will be the slaves that the master finds waiting. And it says, Jesus says the master will actually gird his loins to serve you. This is really unusual because, again, he's speaking into a master-slave culture. But this is kind of shocking and unexpected because anyone hearing this is like, no. There's not a single master I know who would ever do this. And that's kind of Jesus's point, right? That's part of why. Jesus says, in this culture, in this kingdom, if the master finds you ready, you are going to be blessed because the master is going to serve you, right? And later in Luke, we actually see Jesus doing this quite literally when he serves his disciples and washes their feet. If the master finds you waiting, you will be blessed. And mini parable number 3. But if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he wouldn't have let his house get broken into. This is common sense, right? Like, again, this is where one point helps us out because we don't have to wonder what kind of incompetent thief is going to be telling his arrival time to anybody's household. That's not the point. It's like, if you knew he was coming, you'd have done something about it, right? And Jesus uses this mini story along with the others to say, if you knew the time, you'd have been ready. And he summarizes it for us in verse 40. You must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. Summary statement. So this is the point of all three of the mini parables that have gone before. So you don't know the time, and somebody's coming, right? That's the whole point. And I think this is where people actually tend to want to link it to a future coming of Jesus, talking about the Son of Man coming at an unexpected time, that Jesus will come again someday. But I think some context for what Jesus is thinking and what his listeners would have heard would be really helpful for us here. Because Jesus has called himself Son of Man. This is a phrase, this isn't the first time in Luke he's used this. It's actually, I think, the 11th. I may have counted wrong. And he uses it many times after this as well. And in Jesus' day, the children of Israel were awaiting the coming Messiah. Jesus sees himself as the fulfillment of those promises, but also as a clarification of that Messiah expectation, because he thinks of it differently than even they would have, but he sees himself as the fulfillment. He doesn't often, or maybe ever, I don't remember, but I don't think he ever comes right out and says, I am the Messiah. But he does draw these lines between Old Testament promises for what God or the Messiah would do and what he is doing. So we have, for example, in Luke 5, where he says, so that you may know that the Son of Man has come or has the authority on earth to forgive sins. Forgiving sins is something God alone does. But in the context of this verse, Jesus does it to some other people that he's meeting with. And then there's also this passage in Luke 7 where John the Baptist's disciples come and say, are you the one that's coming? Are you the one we've been waiting for? And Jesus' response is, tell John what you've seen. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the leopards are cleaned, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them. These are all things that in the Old Testament, God would have done. And Jesus is saying, go tell them what you've seen. That's Old Testament God stuff right there. All of it. And Jesus frequently uses this phrase, Son of Man, to talk about himself fulfilling the expectations that the Israelites were waiting for, and that God was supposed to come and do. But the phrase itself, the Son of Man, comes from Daniel 7, these two verses. That is actually on two slides because they're long verses. But I saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. To him, to the Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion, the Son of Man's dominion, is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall not be destroyed. And so Jesus, every time he talks about himself as the Son of Man, this is what he's referencing. And he's using this Old Testament language about himself, fulfilling it right now. And by right now, I mean like when he's saying it in front of his disciples all those years ago. He's not talking about some future return. He's not saying, I'm going to leave and when I come back, you don't know when. He's talking to a group of people who have been actively waiting for God to show up for quite a while. And Jesus is using this Daniel language to link himself to the things that they're waiting for, to show that it's already happened. It's already happened now. And so when Jesus says, you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming, he's sort of saying it like a secret shopper showing up at the customer service desk and saying, maybe you should do a good job with your customer service today because you never know when a secret shopper is going to arrive. Right? That is what we're seeing here. Right? He's showing that it's already happened. he is this Daniel figure, and he's standing there with him. He says, you have to be ready, because you don't know when this Daniel figure guy is going to show up. Wink. Right? He is the fulfillment of that. He's standing right in front of them. And any invitations that Jesus gives us in this passage is not for some future time in the distance, for some later due date. It's for the disciples that were immediately around him and any disciples that would come after them. And so that's the point of each of these mini parables, is that you got to start now, because the Son of Man is already here. God and his kingdom has already arrived. The work has begun. The work that Jesus has given them and for us to do is not some nebulous future time, like we can wait and cram for it like a final exam. It's due today. It starts today. And then Peter, in verse 41, you gotta love Peter asking the question that we're probably all thinking. Is this for us or is this for everybody? It's such a great question for him to ask, because it helps us to answer this question for ourselves, right? Like, is Jesus telling these parables just for those people that he's listening to, that are listening to it right in that moment? And I would love for Jesus to just answer it. But like, people ask Jesus so many questions in the Gospels. I think it's something like 300 something questions that either Jesus asked or is asked of him. He answers like 3 of them with a direct answer. Most of them he answers with other questions or with a story, and that's what he does here. But I think he does this to leave space for us to kind of wrestle with, well, is it for us? Does this actually have to do with me, or is this really just for like Peter and his friends that are talking to Jesus that day? But Peter brings up a good point, because I don't think Jesus is just talking to them. I don't think it is just for that like inner circle. It's not just for those disciples, it was also for the crowd. And it wasn't just for the ones hearing it that day, but it's for the people who are hearing it this day. Is it for us, or is it for everybody? I kind of think it's for everybody. But Jesus starts into this sort of second invitation with this elongated parable, which has, like I said, all sorts of things that just feel so culturally distant that it's almost laughable. And I kind of joked, I'm like, John, why'd you give me this passage? Like, come on, couldn't you have taken this one and I'll do like the next, I don't know if next week's any better. Maybe not. But in this extended story, this steward has been given the run of the ground. So the steward is like the head slave who's now been put in charge of the master's household, and he's told to give food at the proper time. And Jesus gives us 2 scenarios to imagine here. The first scenario, what if the steward does what he's supposed to do? What do you think would happen? And again, they're thinking about slave master culture. That slave is going to be blessed. He'll probably be put in charge of more because he's shown himself to be trustworthy. But what if, the task is the same. You're supposed to give food at appointed time. But what if instead this slave decides, nope, my master's not coming. I'm going to eat the food for myself. I'm going to get drunk. I'm going to abuse my fellow workers. What if the steward failed utterly? What do you think would happen? And of course, everyone is like, punishment, death, right? This is what they're thinking. But Jesus, and Jesus goes on in 47 and 48 to kind of give a little bit further. Maybe if they didn't know what was expected, they should only get a mild punishment. And maybe if they did know, they should get a bigger punishment. There are definitely some concerning stuff here, right? Like, we could get really caught up in the weeds. But unlike verse 37, where I said Jesus takes their expectations and flips it, right? Where he shows the master doing something a master would never do. Here, I think he's taking slave master culture and he's showing it in all of its graphic glory. He's like, this is absolutely what would happen. And it would be easy for us, because we're so far removed from that culture, it would be really easy for us to get stuck in all the details that feel foreign and all the stuff that feels horrific. And I think if we did that, we would miss the point of the parable entirely. Because Jesus is telling this story about a steward who is given a task to take care of the master's goods and to care for others. And in one of the examples, the steward instead chose to keep things for themselves and abuse other people. And everybody in Jesus' audience would have been thinking, nope, there is not a single steward who is put over anything that would ever try that. It would not happen because they know the consequences. That's what they're thinking. But that's the whole point, is that no steward who is good at his job would ever do what Jesus described. And just like the steward in this parable, we are actually stewards of God's household, given things, put in charge of things so that we can care for others. And if we only use it for ourselves, if we make it harder for people to get the things that they need, we're not actually doing what's asked or expected of us. The context of this story feels really, really foreign, but I think the impact is illustrated often in our world, where somebody would actually choose to not care for others and instead keep stuff for themselves. When John sort of started this set of teachings that is all about what we do with what God has given us, he talked about how rich even the poorest among us are by global standards, which, as I'm thinking about this passage, got me thinking about like the rich folks, you know, the ones that were like, maybe this is for them. You know, the rich folks, you know, the 100 or the 1,000 people in the US who have $5 trillion, right? So it's about $5 billion apiece for their net worth, while 36 million people in the US are living under the poverty line of only $35,000 a year. Those numbers are really, really startling to me. But I think it's hard for us to understand the scale of difference in money. I don't know why we don't have good concept for money, but we can understand it in time. So I've converted it for us. 35,000 seconds is about 10 hours. All right, everybody have a concept of about how long 10 hours is. 35 million seconds, that's, 1,000 people in the US have on average 5 million seconds, is about 160 years. Which is shocking, I think, the difference in scale. But we have been given what we have, whatever amount it is, whether it's a minute or an hour, to care for the needs of others. But it's hard for me to see numbers like that and not wonder how somebody who has 160 years worth of money, what they would be able to do if they saw themselves as stewards in God's kingdom, right? What could be possible? And so it would be really easy for me to take all of the invitations from today and be like, oh no, this is for them. They've got some stuff to do. They've got some stuff to figure out. But that brings me back to Peter's question, right? Is this for us or is this for everybody? Unfortunately, it's for no, not unfortunately. But in case we miss the point of the story, Jesus summarizes it for us. From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And from one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded. I like to think of this as the Spider-Man clause. This Peter, different Peter than who asked the question in Jesus' story, but this Peter becomes a Spider-Man after encountering a radioactive spider. He gets all these powers. He can climb walls. In some versions, he develops webs. Some versions, he starts shooting webs out of his body. I don't know. In order to figure out how to live with his new life, he gets all this stuff and he's like, what do I do with it? And at one point, his Uncle Ben, who doesn't know about his powers, gives Peter the lesson that shapes his future. You guys know the lesson? You can say it with me, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So this is the Spider-Man clause. That's Jesus' invitation here. That's sort of what he's saying. If you have been given much, much is going to be required of you. And you might look at what you have and you're like, I've got, you talked about 10 hours worth of money. You talked about 160 years worth of money. I've got about 1 hour, worth of money. Like, this can't possibly be for me. But we've been given a lot of things. And that's where, again, the context of this teaching comes back to help us, because we're told this is the same words, to whom much has been given. And right before this passage, we learn about all these things that we've been given. In this context, it says, if you strive for the kingdom, all these things, that was food, shelter, clothing, will be given to you. And then in this passage, it's the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom of God. We have been given so much, an entire kingdom, a kingdom that includes healing and justice and recovery and good news. And we've been given all of this, not so that we can pad our own pockets or to make our own lives easier. We've been given it so that as God cares for us, we can care for the people around us. Because God is the head of our household, and we are stewards of the gifts that we have been given. And there's not some future due date that we have time to procrastinate on. I have good news for those of you who like to wait for the deadline. It's due today. Hopefully that helps. Because the Son of Man, Jesus, has already come, the kingdom has already been given, and the work has already begun. So we start now, and we care for others. And I think, taken in partnership with last week's passage, there's this sense that the only way to be prepared, to be dressed and ready for action, is to kind of travel lightly, to not let stuff weigh us down too much. The invitation is not to use what we want and give away whatever extra we happen to have. The invitation is, none of this is ours anyway. Let's be good stewards and care for the people around us with it. I think it's worth recognizing the tension here, and I want to name it. It's actually present in those other passages just before this one. But what about my needs? Like, I actually need to eat. I actually need shelter. I need clothing. I'm worried that I'm not going to have enough. And in Luke 12:22, Jesus says, don't worry, because the Father wants to give you the things that you need. And I think the other tension is like, well, but what if he doesn't? Right? That's a very real tension. But even there, he says, don't be afraid. Your Father wants to give you good things, even to the end of his kingdom. It doesn't mean it's always easy. I mean, I don't know the last time you've tried telling somebody who is feeling anxious not to worry. Doesn't work all that well, but it also doesn't fix it. But I think there is something to sort of living this out, to actually just trying it, even if it's just an experiment, to say, I'm feeling worried, but I'm going to give away some of my resources anyway. Right? I'm feeling a little scared, but I'm going to try to live into the invitations that Jesus has for me. Because I think the act of living out these invitations can actually change what's possible. It changes the wiring in our brain, it changes our behaviors, it changes and impacts the people around us. We care for others, we seek God's kingdom, and we see what's possible. And I do think the invitation and how it looks is going to be different for every one of us, but the key question is the same. What does it look like to care for others with the resources I have? Whatever they are. You can sort of take stock of what resources you have. And maybe it's time, like actual time, not like money converted to time like I did before. Maybe it's time that you have that you can give to care for others. Offering to cook or clean, or offering childcare. Maybe it's sharing a meal, just as simple as like making a little extra for that meal and inviting your neighbors to join you. Maybe it's listening to people who just don't feel heard. Maybe it's like the buy one, get one free at a grocery store, but you don't need the second one, but you can bring and put it on the community table here in our cafe so that if somebody else needs it, they can take it. Or it could be supporting IPH, which we're going to hear from later in our service. But I think wrestling with this question is part of the work, because asking ourselves this question, allowing it to like bring up all the discomfort, bring up all the tension, that's part of it. That's part of the discipleship work that Jesus is inviting us into, because we have values that are like nested deep in the nooks and crannies of our heart and mind that we don't even think about We don't even question them. And when we wrestle with questions like this, those values come to light and we're like, wait, does this value even align with the kind of person I'm trying to be? It allows space for God to teach us a different way of investing in the world. And so to sort of close out, we have a couple of different ways we're going to respond. So I'm going to pray for us. Our worship team is going to come. We're going to have a song of reflection. We're going to enter a time of communion because our generous God feeds us so that we can feed others. And then we're actually going to hear from an organization that's doing really good work here in the city of Albany and in our surrounding areas. That could be one of the places that you choose to give some of your resources to. So a number of ways to respond, but really wrestling with this question. That's, if you had any homework for today, this is it. This is the question. So let's pray. Jesus, we are grateful that you have given so abundantly and so amazingly out of your goodness, out of your heart, and out of your generosity. God, would you help our values and our behaviors and our actions and the things that we love, would you help them all to align with yours? God, would you help us as we're thinking about our resources, whatever they may be, to look at them with eyes of abundance and not scarcity, to think about the ways that we can use those resources to invest in the people around us, to see ourselves as stewards in your household. God, would you be with us, transform us, be for us all that we need so that we can give ourselves to the world. We pray all of this in your name, Jesus. Amen. Would you stand with us to sing or listen to this song in response?